So I'll give a little bit of an update on the standardization activities that are underway and what we're developing and some of the drivers for those, and also some of the research that we're doing, which is looking at future measurement capabilities and some of the implications that might have in the Indian market. So CEN-TC 264 is a standardization committee. It's responsible for the emissions standards and the ambient air quality standards in Europe. And most of those standards that we develop are there to provide the measurement capabilities to underpin the regulatory instruments, so the regulation within Europe. We have 24 active working groups at the moment, so each one of those working groups is made of technical experts. Those experts come from industry, they come from instrument providers, they come from regulatory authorities, and between us we are developing, I think, more than 30 standards at the moment. One of the key things that we do with our standards, the measurement standards in TC264, is that they have to have validation data. So when we produce a measurement standard, we also have to do validation studies to understand the performance that that standard can provide. We also work closely with ISO TC 146, which is responsible for air quality standards and emission standards internationally. So within ISO TC 146, and that covers stationary source emissions, workplace, ambient, some general standards, and currently in the general committee they're working on standard on the units that are used and the definition of units of measurement, also meteorology and indoor air. And the Secretariat of Subcommittee 1, which is the stationary source emissions, is held currently with MPL India. So there are 3 work items currently underway in 146. 2 are the revision of the flow standard, and we've heard talk about reporting mass emissions and emissions trading, and clearly if you're going to do that you need to be able to measure flow and have flow CEMs, and so those 2 standards provide both the manual reference method and also the CEM standard for flow monitoring. And there's also a gaseous fluoride standard under development. Within Europe, as I say, we are driven by a number of regulations, one of which is the Industrial Emissions Directive. And a lot of the work that we're doing at the moment related to emission standards is because the regulation was revised in 2024 and is coming into force pretty much this year in terms of some guidance which the Commission is producing and an implementing act. And that currently there are about 37,000 industrial installations and about the same number of industrial farm. So the revision of the IED brought in agriculture into the regulation. And so that's the kind of emissions monitoring needed there, is fugitive emissions monitoring from the waste handling and the barns. So we have a number of new sources. And the regulation also brought in a whole range of new industrial sources, including landfill, some metal and the battery factories and recycling. And one of the big issues we face at the moment is that the regulation is forcing the emission limit values, the concentration levels, down. And so we are having to revise the standards to meet lower and lower levels. As I mentioned earlier, the Commission has also published a clean industrial deal, so the regulation there is pushing for growth through cleaner industry. We also have a methane regulation, which is an act requiring energy industry, so the gas industry and mining, coal mining, to report and measure and reduce methane emissions. And so this is all forcing new standards to be produced, including we have new pollutants, and we're looking at PFAS and nitrosamines coming from cleaner energy, and new sectors, as I say, methane and agriculture. I just wanted to put this slide up just to show how we manage the whole quality of emissions monitoring in Europe. And we heard a lot about the kind of requirements from Sanjeev around putting in place the quality assurance. So the primary standard that we have is EN 14181, and that defines how CEMs or AMS instruments are brought under control. 14181 provides how we control the quality of the data from the automated measuring systems, or the CEMs systems. And the way that works in Europe is that we have the pre-assessment, so that's the type approval, so that's the same kind of testing that MPL India are undertaking for the Indian market. And the performance testing standards is 15267, and we have a part 3 for continuous monitors and a part 4 for portable instruments that are used if you're going to calibrate instruments using as reference instruments. And the way that we control annually the CEMs instruments in Europe is that test teams, accredited test teams, carry out reference measurements, and so the calibration is against reference standards. And so we have reference standards and we have alternate reference methods which are then used on annual assessment of the analyzers. And that's both a calibration, the Qual2 approach, parallel measurements with the reference method and the CEMs, and then annual checks, the annual surveillance checks. So every 3 or 5 years, we do a recalibration. But we also have a standard for the data handling. So this is a standard for data handling systems, and these data handling systems are also certified, and also the test teams have to carry out annual surveillance functional checks that those data handling systems are working. And those are the kind of checks that you might do to show that, yes, the correct calibration function has been entered into the data handling system, or, as has happened in the past, you haven't put the calibration function in twice, once into the AMS and once into the data handling system. Also, that the correct channels are connected up. We then have certification and performance requirements on the test teams themselves. So the personnel who carry out the monitoring, there are requirements and there are proficiency test schemes. So the people who carry out monitoring, we can demonstrate the capability for the teams and the personnel. And we have proficiency testing standards for those people who provide proficiency testing schemes for those teams. There are standards for those proficiency testing providers as well. So we have a whole ecosystem of standards that all work together to underpin the quality, and we are continually revising and reviewing those standards. So these are the standards that are currently being revised or have recently been developed. We're producing guidance on how to do that annual check of the data handling systems. We're currently revising EN 14181, and we have other revisions and new standards related to the new Industrial Emissions Directive 2.0. I won't go through these in detail, but these I'll leave in the presentation. These are the current active working groups, and these are the standards that we're currently working on. We have long-term dioxin sampling, we have long-term mercury sampling, we have several activities in working group 9 related to the revision of 14181 that I chair, and then we have bioaerosols and diffuse VOCs and methane emissions from industrial sources, a new standard on formaldehyde, standards on instrumental odor monitoring, just published a standard on proficiency testing, and we also have a task force emissions that looks at overall emissions related issues and identifies guidance and new issues on emissions. We have a new standard looking at emissions from buildings, and that relates to the agricultural emissions. And we have a new working group started looking at per and polyfluoryl alkyl substances. So these are some of the work that we have currently underway. As I say, we're revising 14181. We have the revision of the flow standard, and we have new and future standards looking at nitrosamine and amine emissions from carbon capture and storage, and a new standard underway to look at standards that will support the monitoring and reporting of methane emissions. So 15446 is a sniffing standard for leak detection from industrial sources, and we have a new standard we will be doing on high flow monitors that quantify leaks and fugitive emissions. And the Commission is asking us to produce standards for ammonia, chlorine, and chlorine oxide. This is a list of recent standards. The talk will be available. I won't go through this in detail, but these are just some of the standards that we have recently published in the last 3 years. Just briefly on the revision of 14181. So within Working Group 9 that I chair, because of changes to the regulation and changes to the reference standards, we understood we needed to revise 14181, but we also took the opportunity to review the issues. And it was last revised in 2014, and we basically looked to a set of changes to bring it up to date. We requested what the potential changes would be, and we got 46 pages of comments from the users of the standard. We've reviewed those, and we have underway some subgroups who are looking at aspects of Working Group 9 of 14181 to revise. That includes the Qual 3, the ongoing control of the analyzers. So this is the drift correction of the analyzers. We also have guidance on how to carry out functional tests that the instruments are working properly. And we're looking at the statistics and the uncertainty from the Qual 2 calibration function. And these are some of the work we're doing. And the work on the side, the graphs on the side, is just some work I've been doing, taking historical calibration functions and running through the uncertainty of the reference methods. So as I say, the calibration is calibration of a reference method in parallel with the instrument. But as we're going to lower and lower concentrations, the uncertainty in the reference method is becoming more significant. And so we are, I did some Monte Carlo analysis of how that uncertainty feeds through the calibration function. So we hope basically to get a revision of that standard through and the first draft out next year. But that will provide some new guidance and some new approaches, and potentially new approaches to the Qual 2 function. And just in case you're aware, ISO adopted 14181 but gave it a new number, 20181, because there was an existing ISO standard. So while the revision is happening in CEN, we will then clearly look to where ISO will look to see whether it wants to revise the ISO version in line with that. Just to give you an update, we are revising, we have a new working group looking at polyfluoroalkyl substances. And as you may be aware, there's about 5,000 chemicals. And so this is a challenge to identify which species. Now, you may think, historically, PFAS has been a water quality problem, and maybe this should be over in the other stage. But increasingly, we're seeing air transport of emissions, so aerosolized PFAS going into the atmosphere and being deposited in rain.